We are fortunate to have Dr. Preston Foeder, also a psychology professor at UTC. Dr. Foeder did not work with Chantex, but he's done some very, very interesting research having to do with elephant problem solving. So he can give us kind of a cross-species perspective on intelligence and cognition. We also have Professor Warren Roberts, who is joining us tonight, and he is also an anthropologist in the department at UTC. He was, at the time, a research assistant on the Project Chantex research program, and he did double-blind testing of Chantex vocabulary. We also have Dr. Nikki Osbeck from the psychology department. She is joining us. She did work with Dr. Miles on the Chantex project. She did testing of Chantex with the Bailey scales of infant development and the Paget intellectual stages of development. So she was directly involved, and certainly we have Dr. Miles, who is going to be joining us. And shortly, we're going to have Sally Thomas join us as well. She is currently a marketing researcher at Wilkins Research Services here in Chattanooga. But at the time when Chantex was here, she was a UTC student. So she worked with Chantex directly during the 1980s, and I understand from Dr. Miles that she has some amazing, kind of heartwarming stories about Chantex growth and development. So we will hear from Ms. Thomas in just a moment as well. So we are going to basically open up the floor for questions. I've got a microphone. I'm going to come down. If you have a question, then I will hand the microphone to you, and hopefully we'll have a lively discussion in just a little bit.
I have a question. I always understood that male orangutans in the wild lived on their own, completely by themselves, and that the females and the babies lived separately. I felt that Dr. Maple is making a kind of too big a claim for reality when he says that orangutans should live naturally, like they're living naturally at the zoo. Am I wrong? Do they live in family groups as they do at Zoo Atlanta? Or is my earlier knowledge about orangutans correct?
I can answer that. Orangutans are the most solitary of the great apes. They live over vast swaths of rainforest. They do have a social system in that they are in contact with each other, though generally through calls and scent markings, and they don't form naturally what you would think of, say, like a gorilla social system, where you have a dominant male and females. However, one of the interesting things is that when you put them in captivity, they form that social system. They form a dominant male with a harem society very naturally. And that's the way we see them when we see them in zoos. So they seem to be flexible in terms of their social systems, whereas in their natural system they're spread out. But in contact, and it seems that they're able to bring it down into a smaller captive situation.
Stand up if you want to ask a question so I can get over to you. Yay, there's a brave soul. Come on. You guys are lucky you're not in my class. I harass people.
Hi, Dr. Miles Claxton. You were mentioning in class actually earlier today about how Chantec does arts and crafts, makes paintings and creates jewelry, and I was surprised the video didn't mention anything about that, and I just was kind of wondering why they would forget such an interesting and kind of important aspects of Chantec's life.
Gee, the check will be in the mail. Am I on great? We talked to the producers of the film with Blink Television of London, and I brought along for you an example of some of that artwork. Thanks, Warren. And they decided for this film not to feature his arts and crafts so much as the emotional relationship. My Wild Affair was about relationships between people and non-human species. But I did bring some examples. See if I can get this out for you. This is an example of one of his necklaces. You can see this. And what's interesting is he very often puts the clasp kind of on the side, not necessarily always in back.
Yeah.
And then this is an example of one of his found art assemblage. If I can get it uncoiled here. And they make beautiful wall hangings. In fact, the Smithsonian Institution has one of these on display. Can you see? So I thank you and the artist thanks you.
Hello, I'm Preston, I'm so noisy. My understanding from things I've heard from Dr. Robert Long, did I right this time? I'm just switching up a minute. Or Robert. Is that he often, even when you visit him, now that you're back to being allowed to visit him again, often indicates to you and sometimes to him that he wants you to come get him and take him home. And I've asked, I know that there's been movements in the past to try and get him to our zoo more locally, even though it has insufficient space for properly housing him. But perhaps we could share him with the Zoo Atlanta for brief periods of time so he could be with his family and be, as it were, with his family here and then go back to his other family down there. Is that even in the works? I mean, they lost their children.
Well, there have been discussions about that. I'm not really aware of what may or may not be thought about with that regarding now at this moment in time. But is this better? I'm not really sure about this moment in time, in history, about how that would work. There have been problems in the past, nor am I sure that would be ideal. The thing with Chantec and apes in general is zoos are odd places. And you have this ape who was raised to be enculturated as a human child, goes to the zoo, and we heard what Terry Maple had to say about that, about what's appropriate, making a return to apeness for him, implying that there's some kind of hardwired, natural way that an ape should live. At the same time that he's violating that and demonstrating the opposite by playing off of this behavioral plasticity that Chantec has and keeping this artificial social group and all this. Also important to remember, I worked at Zoo Atlanta for a while doing research with gorillas. There were 18 of them at the time. And in doing that work, one of the obvious things is that the orangutan enclosures look more like a gorilla enclosure. If you're going to talk about orangutan nature, then you should put them 60 feet up in a tree in a swamp. Having them on these exposed hillsides is really strange. But also, that the apes would be released about 11 o'clock in the morning, and then they would be brought in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So for most of their day, they're actually in indoor holding facilities, which are tile and iron bars. Right? So there's mesh fence, iron bars, tile, and concrete for most of their day. And then they're let outside to play for a few hours to be on exhibit. The ethical problems that come up are potential ethical problems. If you have an ape that can sign and can communicate their displeasure with where they are, all these kinds of issues aren't necessarily things that zoos want to advertise. I mean, they don't really want an animal saying, you know, this place doesn't make me happy, where's my TV, I want a bag of chips, this is awful, what did I do wrong and take me home? This is not something that they want to advertise. So I'm not sure that problem would be any different here or in any other zoo. There's this weird sort of movement in zoo culture to keep things green and brown, natural. An enculturated ape is a wrench thrown in all of those gears. Those problems would just recur. And also, you have to look at the record of this zoo with its apes. And there was a counterpoint to Chantek in that our zoo had a chimpanzee named Hank, overlapping in time with Chantek. And Hank had been a circus ape who then goes, he was also known to escape. He did injure a few people during his escapes. For many years, he was kept in solitary confinement. Our zoo's changed a bit. But I'm not even sure that would be desirable. What would be desirable would be some kind of relatively unprecedented facility to really highlight the abilities of apes and to bring people into engagement, allowing apes to express ape nature in the sense of problem solving, cognitive mapping, like Chantek was doing the whole time he's driving around. That's like having to find patchily distributed food in forests. So these things are part of ape nature too. And ideally, I'd like to see Chantek somewhere where he could express those parts of his being.
On other places like that, sometimes where the facility built for
Sort of. Yeah. It's an odd place, but yeah.
Maybe I could just follow up before you take that question, Pam. I wanted to kind of build on what Warren is saying. One concept I've had, I told my students today, is the Chan Tech, like Georgia Tech Academy, where it would be an animal culture center. If you follow the natural argument of the zoo, zoos try really hard to replicate the physical environment with gunite, stone, and some grass. But as Warren pointed out, they're there only a few hours. It's not usually incorporated into the learning. They're not doing a lot of foraging or navigation. And they don't replicate the psychological challenges of the natural world. Navigation, dealing with conspecifics, problem solving, all the cognitive things that you have to do for survival. So it's good to talk natural and green, etc., but it has to be culturally elaborated as well. Orangutans naturally make 2 different toolkits of sticks that they use to process different food. And they carry it around with them, and they figure out problems for which toolkit they need to use. They make umbrellas out of big leaves. They make shelter. And so if we're going to talk about natural behaviors, we have to include the natural culture of these animals as well. One thing that disturbed me about the film is when Terry Maple, the former director, talked about taking animals out of nature. Chiswick was born in Atlanta at the Yerkes Center, but the implication was somehow we had plucked him from a natural environment and now he could go back to nature. So thank you, I just wanted to clear that up.
So I guess my question is probably for Dr. Osbeck. What did you find from your Stanford Binet and, what was it, the PJ studies? And also, did that speak to theory of mind at all?
Well, probably Dr. Miles can talk about the test results, but very similar to humans. Very, very, very similar. When you go through the Piaget stages of qualitative shifts in cognition, he went through those too. So, for example, when we're very young, we have out of sight, out of mind, and once you get object permanency, you know even though you're hiding that thing, it's there. And that particular parenting strategy will no longer work, and it's going to be the same with Shantech and every one of the great apes. They go through the exact same thing as our human children do, as we did ourselves. I would also like to say, because I'm the emotional side of Shantech, not only did I get to see him as an infant, but I've been with Lynn to the Atlanta Zoo. At the time, they let her go behind the scenes and not be a visitor. And we had a mode in between us, and Shantech wanted Naya water, which is a type of bottled water that he likes better than the other water. And she did not have it. She had the wrong bottled water. And if this doesn't sound like a human child, he turned his back so she couldn't talk to him anymore. He was mad. He was definitely mad. So then he comes with me. She is trying to tell him to share with the female that he was with. And he had a cracker, and if you could see the crumb, you have better eyesight than I have, but he held out to the female. So his version of sharing would be very much like our young children when they share. It's begrudgingly shared. It was begrudgingly shared. So not only are they mirroring many of the cognitive steps that we go through as humans, but you see it in the emotional development also.
Shantech showed amazing empathy. There was an occasion where it started to rain and I was working with him at the zoo, and I didn't have an umbrella, it was just a downpour. And he had this thick, heavy, stiff cloth, and they're so strong. He took it and he ripped it in half. He put half on his head and he pushed it through the bars and told me to put it on my head. And we stood there in the rain together, and the only thing he said was rain, rain. In terms of the scientific research, he made it, I know, to Piaget pre-operational period, 2 to 4-year-old, and other cognitive tests up to a 7 or 8-year-old child, maybe even beyond.
Did you ever do a British test?
I don't think so, no. But if you volunteer, we'll work up a study.
Okay, hi guys. My name is Riley and I work at the Chattanooga Zoo. So I took a class with Dr. Osbeck, and ever since then I've been completely obsessed and intrigued by Shantech, to the point of I made a best friend that worked at Zoo Atlanta and she let me go and see him. But my question is, when you were doing your research with Shantech and you were designing what you wanted to study, did you base that on any other research, like Coco the gorilla? Or maybe what did your research, like how did it separate your research from theirs?
Well, this would be a good lesson really for all of us. I started this research because my boyfriend gave me a book to review. And it was about people teaching sign language to apes. And I thought, this is incredible. I was thinking of becoming an astronomer, and I thought I might join the SETI project. And I thought, we've got a non-human intelligence right here on Earth that we could communicate with. So the first thing I did was work with Washoe, the first chimpanzee to learn sign language. I went to Oklahoma. Roger Fouts had been a graduate student of the Gardeners, and now he had a whole colony of signing apes. Worked with Bowie and Alley and other famous signing apes, and really kind of learned the ropes from them. I also got to visit with Coco and sign with Coco. And also Nim Chimpsky was a chimpanzee who learned sign language. And that researcher took a negative view, felt that Nim was mostly just imitating and was not very spontaneous in his signing. But when Nim moved to Oklahoma under more relaxed conversational conditions, his signing was more like the other apes. I've also had opportunity to work with Kanzi, the bonobo that uses computer language, and I visited with some other apes that have had this training. So if Chattanooga Zoo is interested, maybe we should talk.
Hello? Okay. Would you say other apes who live at the zoo feel the same way Chantec does, even though they've never been a part of culturally adjusted societies? Do you think they still wish they could escape where they have like worse conditions and they know this, but they can't express it?
Anybody want to take that?
It's being thrown to me, so I'm going to deflect it. Let me go back to the Rouge test question, and then I'll get to you, because I was thinking, the Rouge test is you put a mark on an animal's, on a person or an animal's face to see if they recognize themselves in a mirror. And yes, orangutans have passed the mark test and do recognize themselves in mirrors. Get back to that quick. Okay.
That's on a human infant IQ test, by the way.
Yeah.
That particular task is. So when you're testing babies, which we do sometimes before adoption, so the parents know if this child has some developmental delays or not up front. That is on those tests. That particular test is done. That is, can you recognize yourself in a mirror or not?
Okay, now I'll get back to your question. Okay, so, the animals at Zoo Atlanta, apart from Chantec, the orangutans, I believe, are all captive born, as are about 98% of all animals in zoos at this point. Animals are rarely brought in from the wild for zoos. They don't know anything else. I really doubt they have some instinctive knowledge that they need to be somewhere else.
Unless you think they can express all their own happiness.
Can they
express all their own happiness?
Can they express all their own happiness?
Unhappiness.
Can they express their unhappiness? Yeah, animals can express unhappiness. Okay. Anybody who has pets or a dog or a cat knows that the animals can express unhappiness, and any zookeeper will tell you when the animals are not having a good day. So they can't express it. They may not have a sign for it, but they're just as likely to turn their back on you, and they have ways of expressing it, and which is one of the reasons why you stay on the opposite side of the bars with most animals that aren't enculturated.
Especially dolphins.
Especially elephants.
You might not be able to answer this, really, that's okay, but it said in the video, the girl that was attacked, that she wasn't seriously injured. Was she startled? I'm a little bit confused about like what the incident was that caused him to be like in basically solitary confinement for 11 years or however long it was.
From a university standpoint, any keepers of wild animals, according to legal liability, there's a concept in the law called strict liability, which means that there's no affirmative defense for any kind of wrong that the animal does, knowingly or unknowingly. So we were faced with that here at the university. Chantec was a pretty smart guy. He would get out and get into mischief, and one of the things that he would like to do is that he would kind of break into dormitories at night, because during the day there were vending machines there, and he knew that potato chips and things that he liked came out of those machines. That's how his mind worked. So he would get out and have his little coins that really did not work in the vending machines. And when that didn't work, he was strong. So he would pick the machine up and shake it. That's the kind of behavior we were struggling with. So one Saturday, he saw a young lady at the library. He did not hurt this student, by the way. In fact, the graduate student. Well, anytime a wild animal contacts someone, that's the perception of people. But the reality of life was that he did hold on to this young lady. The young lady was a graduate student who was in special education at that time, saw this as kind of acting out behavior of a child. That's how she related the incident. At the end of the day, but it got reported as something else. But when the legal team heard that, now this was a young lady in special ed, imagine that you are a visitor to the campus and suddenly you get the King Kong syndrome. So that's what we were struggling with. The young lady was not hurt, by the way. Security did a good job of separating them. One of the things that Shantech liked, he liked Coca-Colas and he liked M&Ms. So the security staff always kept Coca-Colas and M&Ms in the patrol cars. So when Shantech was out, they could always coax him back in by saying, "Want M&Ms? Let's go back," and he'd go back and get his money and pay for it, and he'd go to bed. So that's how we got him away from the graduate student. They actually kind of paid him out.
I actually have two questions. They're kind of different. First off, is there any states that are legally considering apes as persons? And second off is how much progress have you made in making the Chantech Academy where apes can be peacefully and
I think a couple of us can take that. Spain and New Zealand have declared great apes as non-human persons. And right now there is a case in court in Upper New York State having to do with a chimpanzee that was a pet. And none of us here on the panel recommend these great apes as pets. This was a scientific research project. There's some indication the chimp is under not good conditions or maybe has been abused. And so this is a effort on the part of a Harvard attorney, Steve Wise. They've prepared for this for 30 years. There's a team of 9 attorneys working on it, and they are waiting to see the judge's decision. It would apply only in this case, but it would set legal precedent, and there are several other cases having to do with great apes that are in the wings. One thought that I've had in attempting to persuade Zoo Atlanta to allow more culture and more signing studies is, I don't know, maybe we could put Chantech in the witness stand and have him talk about his abilities and let the court and the community judge whether he has the minimal skills for not being a human being. You know, he's not going to be, building the Eiffel Tower, but nonetheless a kind of intelligent being of the non-human kind.
Sally, I'm going to ask a question
Of you, as a UTC student, I mean, that was an amazing opportunity to be able to work with Dr. Miles on this project and to have hands-on experiences with the orangutan. So I would really appreciate hearing your perspective about this when you were a student and the opportunity that it presented to you.
Well, it truly was probably the best time of my life. I'm almost ashamed to admit to you students how I discovered anthropology, which turned into the joy of my life. I had thought when I came here to UTC that I would major in political science. I took some courses in political science. And I thought, oh, maybe special ed's for me. I took some courses in special ed. And I needed an anthropology, a class, any class that met on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 1:30, an elective, because that's when I could be at the university at this particular semester. And I thought, I turned to the A's and I thought, anthropology, this is a word that I've heard. Don't know anything about this word. I think I should know what this means. So I signed up.
Chattanooga, and remembers all of the people that he worked with. Certainly, over the years, when people have come to visit him at Zoo Atlanta, he remembers them instantly. The second question was what again?
I want to know how you thought the project supported human evolution.
Oh, that's really interesting. You know, with Richard here, there was some nervousness at the university. I mean, we are in the Bible Belt and Dayton, and that great trial up the road in the beautiful courthouse is close to us. And so we had some discussions about the implications of the project for human evolution. I'm an anthropologist, a scientist, and we certainly see evidence for human evolution. We support that entirely. But I must say that at various times, about half of the students who worked on the Chantech project were creationists and quite committed Christians. And we would have some interesting discussions. And one creationist student said, you know what? God just made orangutans intelligent.
Okay, do you guys think that at any point in Chantech's life he could have been maybe not necessarily released into the wild because of the way he was raised, but do you think that he could have been put in maybe a sanctuary and thrive there better than he would like in the zoo or in the facility in Atlanta? And not so much just Chantech, but do you think other apes raised the way Chantech was could thrive in like a sanctuary like that?
Yeah, I'll let Preston and Warren address that issue broadly. In terms of Chantech, toward the end, as we saw, we really had to find another home for him. We tried very hard. We called everywhere. We even talked to Prince Rainier of Monaco to see if we could move Chantech to Europe. An interesting issue emerged, and that is Chantech is biracial. And I am part Blackfoot and Coast Salish Native American, part European. I'm biracial also. Zoos, in their effort to maintain the genomes of different species, had some strong rules about biracial orangutans. They didn't want a mulatto orangutan disturbing the genetic pool of orangutans either in Borneo and Sumatra. So we were all set to go to return Chantech to a natural setting. We were wondering if we would teach sign language to orangutans in Indonesia, but the broader animal community put an end to that option. We certainly looked for other sanctuaries, etc., and we're still looking. This concept of a primate culture center or an animal culture academy is a concept that I hope catches on with all zoos. And so it won't be just Chantech experiencing these cultural opportunities along with his natural life, but it's an opportunity that will be open to elephants, to parrots. We know crows, for example, are incredibly intelligent, and we've got a crow here at Chattanooga Zoo. So one of the entertainers who got involved with this research, Peter Gabriel of Genesis fame, some of you may know the old rock group Genesis, he wrote a song and talked about apes using language and said, who knows where this will end. So I hope that ultimately, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we're here in this auditorium with some really good news about Chantech's future. Do you guys want to talk about more specifics about returning animals to natural settings?
Okay, we may wind up on two sides of this debate. Let me, first of all, it is incredibly hard to return any animal that is born in captivity to the wild. It almost always fails. For one thing, that they are used to human beings, and they go and they search out human beings, and either the human being or the animal. Usually the animal is hurt in the exchange. So it's very, very difficult, and so most of the animals that are in captivity in zoos or sanctuaries cannot be returned to the wild. It's just really not possible without extreme effort and a lot of failure. Let me put in a word for zoos here over sanctuaries. People tend to think that sanctuary means a good place and the zoo means the bad place. The way most sanctuaries are set up at this point is they have a lot of space, but they are run on volunteer donations. Generally, they do not have a professional staff. They have volunteers, and they do not have a dedicated vet. Zoos in this country at this point have an extreme accreditation process that they have to go through. They are very concerned with the welfare of their animals and are doing the best that they possibly can. At this point, most of my work has been with elephants. Every zoo that has elephants is in the process of creating the largest possible exhibit they can for their elephants. They have professional staffs. They have dedicated veterinarians that just work with their zoo animals, and they tend to get the very best care. And no one, let me put a word in here for zookeepers, no one cares for animals like zookeepers. They are not paid enough to do the work that they do without caring and wanting to be with those animals and do the best for those animals they can every day. I've done research in, it's upwards of half a dozen zoos at this point. So this comes from experience, and was a zookeeper for a short period of time.
I think we have time for one
Last question.
The question is, did, like with people, when they're in groups, people will form differences and maybe not like someone because of a personality trait or the way they look. Did Shantech ever show any of those type of things toward anyone who was working with him?
Shantech liked heavy-set people with red hair. And occasionally we noticed there was, we think at one point at the Yerke Center there might have been a technician that didn't rise to the standard that Preston was talking about. He seemed to be a little fearful of somebody who was a certain physical type, so it's possible that something occurred that hurt Shantech or Shantech took offense with, but mostly he just loved people who looked like orangutans. He would adore you. Just your long red hair.
What I want to do right now is thank the members of our panel for holding this discussion. I want to thank everybody who attended tonight's event. And should you have additional questions, I know Dr. Miles has gotten amazing feedback. This film has been shown in different countries. We have been fielding calls at the university, in the office, from all over the world. So she can add some very interesting comments about the kind of feedback, because it certainly has come in, and it's somewhat mixed, I would say, but overall, there's great concern for Chantek's and for his well-being. So thank you for coming. Please feel free to come up and ask the members of the panel additional questions.